Many years ago, in a close-knit community, there was a vibrant church renowned for its divine teachings and miraculous healings. At its helm was Pastor Alex, a man admired for his powerful sermons, spiritual gifts, and his uncanny ability to comfort the brokenhearted. Every Sunday, the church overflowed with worshipers who came seeking a touch from God through Alex's ministry. To them, he was more than just a pastor. He was a beacon of hope, a symbol of righteousness, and the living embodiment of God's grace. Yet, behind the glowing facade lay a shadowy past, a secret so dark it could shatter the very foundation of his carefully constructed life. One fateful Sunday, after delivering an electrifying sermon on forgiveness and repentance, Alex stood at the church doors, shaking hands and offering warm smiles to his congregation. But just as he was about to turn away, his eyes fell on two familiar faces in the crowd: Tony and Collins. His heart skipped a beat. 16 years earlier, Alex had been a very different man. During his university days, he was deeply entrenched in the world of cultism. Alongside Tony and Collins, he belonged to a fearsome group known for its reign of terror, kidnappings, violent confrontations, and chaos. They were the stuff of nightmares, leaving behind scars that would haunt the university long after they were gone. But Alex had walked away from that life, or so he thought. Driven by guilt and a yearning for redemption, he sought solace in God, reinventing himself as a man of the new heart. With time, he buried his past beneath layers of good deeds, powerful sermons, and a new identity as Pastor Alex. Yet, as he stood frozen at the door, locking eyes with Tony and Collins, he realized the truth. No matter how far you run, the shadows of your past will always find you. And now they had come knocking on his sanctuary. Upon sighting them, Alex's heart sank like a stone in deep water. Tony and Collins, names he hadn't spoken aloud in over a decade, were once his closest allies during his dark days in the cult. Together, they had been as ruthless as they were feared. Their presence in his church wasn't a coincidence. Alex could see it in their smirks and the glint in their eyes. These men hadn't come for salvation, they had come for him. When they approached him after the service, Alex's mouth went dry. They exchanged cold pleasantries, though he could barely meet their gaze. He forced a strained smile, but inside, his thoughts were racing. The church ushers, unaware of the tension, warmly welcomed them alongside other first-time visitors. Tony and Collins played along, even promising to return the following Sunday. Alex's unease deepened. He could feel their eyes on him throughout the next Sunday service, scrutinizing every move, every word. That night, as he lay in bed, he prayed fervently, asking God to remove these men from his life. In the weeks that followed, Tony and Collins became regular attendees. They always sat in the same spot, close enough for Alex to see them, but far enough to avoid suspicion. Their smirks grew more knowing with each service, and Alex found himself dreading Sundays. He couldn't shake the feeling that his past was creeping closer, threatening to engulf the new life he had built. One quiet afternoon, after a midweek service, Tony and Collins approached him as he prepared to leave the church. "Pastor," Tony called, his voice as smooth as it was unsettling. "We need a moment of your time." Alex hesitated, his hand tightening around the Bible he carried. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse to send them away. But his congregation was nearby, and he couldn't afford to arouse suspicion. Reluctantly, he nodded and led them into his office. The moment the door closed, the atmosphere shifted. The polite facade Tony and Collins had worn vanished, replaced by something cold and predatory. Tony leaned against the door, blocking the exit, while Collins settled into a chair across from Alex, his grin sharp as a blade. "Alex," Tony began, his tone low and menacing, "are you seriously going to pretend you don't recognize us? Come on. Don't insult us like that." Alex's voice faltered as he tried to respond. "I've left that life behind. I'm not the same person anymore." Collins chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "Oh, we know who you are, Pastor," he sneered, leaning forward. "You think a suit and a Bible can erase everything you've done? The blood on your hands doesn't wash off that easily." Alex felt the weight of their words press down on him like a vice. His palms grew sweaty and his pulse thundered in his ears. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tony smirked, pushing off the door and walking slowly towards Alex. "We're businessmen now, Alex. Successful ones too. And we have a very lucrative proposal for you." Alex swallowed hard. "I'm not interested in any business," he said, forcing steel into his voice. "Whatever you're selling, take it elsewhere." Collins's grin widened. "Oh, but you'll want to hear this one. You see, we're dealing in human organs now. There's big money in it. money that could change anyone's life. And we want you to join us as a supplier." The words hit Alex like a punch to the gut. His stomach churned and his vision blurred for a moment. "You're insane," he said, shaking his head. "I'm a pastor. I'm not getting involved in something so monstrous." Tony's expression darkened, the playful smirk disappearing. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Don't play righteous with us, Alex. We know what you did. We were there. Do you think anyone in your precious congregation would still listen to you if they knew the truth?" Alex's blood ran cold. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Collins leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "It's simple, Pastor. You help us get what we need and your little secret stays buried. Refuse and we'll make sure everyone knows who you really are. Your church, your family, your entire reputation, it'll all come crashing down." Alex felt like the walls were closing in on him. He wanted to scream, to throw them out of his office and out of his life. But the fear was paralyzing. The past he had worked so hard to bury was clawing its way to the surface, and these men held the shovel. "This is extortion," Alex managed to say, his voice shaking. Tony shrugged. "Call it what you want. But you don't have a choice. We'll give you some time to think it over, Pastor. Don't take too long." With that, they stood and left, leaving Alex alone in his office. He sat there for hours, his mind racing, his heart heavy with dread. He knew he was standing at the edge of a precipice, and one wrong step could send him plummeting into the abyss. That night, Alex prayed like never before, tears streaming down his face. But no matter how much he begged God for guidance, the only thing he felt was the cold grip of despair tightening around his soul. For months, Alex lived in torment. Tony and Collins hounded him with relentless threats and ominous warnings. It began subtly. A mysterious note slipped under his office door, its message brief but chilling: "We know who you are." Then came the phone calls, their voices dripping with menace. The pressure was unbearable, a vice tightening around his soul. Alex prayed and fasted fervently, begging God for a way out, but the fear of his past being exposed consumed him. One fateful morning, Alex walked into his office to find something that made his blood run cold. Laid out on his desk were pictures from his past, grainy photographs of him posing with his old cult group, a bottle in one hand, a machete in the other. His heart pounded as he picked up one photo, his fingers trembling. "How did they get these?" he whispered, his voice shaking. He stared at the photos in horror. There he was, flanked by Tony and Collins, their faces younger but no less sinister. These were the very images he had burned years ago, determined to erase any trace of his dark history. Yet here they were, resurrected and mocking him. A sticky note attached to one of the pictures bore a chilling message: "Your congregation would love to see this." Alex felt his knees buckle as he slumped into his chair. His mind raced. If these pictures surfaced, his life would be over. His church, his ministry, his family, everything he had built would crumble. He tried to steady his breathing, but his panic only grew when he noticed something else. A second note that read, "We're watching your wife and kids." A wave of nausea hit him. Tony and Collins were no longer just threatening him, they were inching closer to the people he loved most. Alex envisioned his wife, Margaret, and their two children, Sandra and Caleb, being dragged into this nightmare. The thought was unbearable. He clenched his fists and muttered, "God help me. Please help me." The next evening, Tony and Collins confronted him in his office. They leaned against the door, their presence suffocating. Alex barely managed to keep his composure as they tossed another envelope onto his desk. Inside were more damning photos and a USB drive. "Take a look," Tony said, smirking. "It's a little video we thought your church board might find enlightening." Alex hesitated, his hands shaking as he plugged the USB drive into his computer. The screen flickered to life, revealing grainy footage of a cult initiation ceremony. There he was, younger and wild-eyed, leading a group chant while holding a machete. His heart sank further as he watched scenes of chaos. Him breaking into a dormitory, his group terrorizing students, one that involved where he molested the vice-chancellor's daughter, while others laughed at the background. "We kept souvenirs," Collins said, his tone mocking. "Thought you'd like a little trip down memory lane." Alex slammed the laptop shut, his face pale. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "It's simple," Tony said, leaning closer. "You work for us now. We're running a business and you're going to be our supplier. Organs are in demand, Pastor." "Never," Alex said through gritted teeth. "I'm not doing it. I've turned away from that life. I'm a man of God now." Collins laughed, a dark, menacing sound. "Man of God? Please, A leopard doesn't change its spots. You've got blood on your hands already. You think a Bible can wash that away? Tony's voice dropped, cold and threatening. Here's the deal, either you help us or those photos and videos go public. Oh, and we'll make sure Margaret and your precious little kids get a visit. Wouldn't want anything to happen to them, would you? Alex froze, his throat tightening. The thought of his family being hurt paralyzed him with fear. Please, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Leave them out of this. That's entirely up to you, Tony said, his grin widening. Play along and we'll keep your secret safe. Refuse and, well, you can imagine the rest. For days Alex couldn't eat or sleep. His mind was consumed with dread, the images of his family in danger haunting him. He tried to think of a way out but saw none. The blackmailers had him cornered and he felt powerless to stop them. The threats escalated. One morning Margaret found a note in their mailbox. It read, "Your husband isn't who you think he is." Alex snatched it from her hands before she could read further, claiming it was junk mail. But he saw the worry in her eyes and knew time was running out. Desperate to protect his family, Alex finally caved. Just this once, he told himself, his voice shaking as he stared at his reflection in the mirror. I'll do it once to keep them quiet and then it'll be over. That evening, his heart heavy with guilt, Alex identified Emeka, a bright and cheerful boy who had been coming to him for Bible lessons. Emeka admired Alex deeply, often staying after class to ask questions about God and faith. Alex chose Emeka because he trusted the boy's innocence, knowing the child would follow him without question. "Forgive me, Lord," Alex whispered as he planned the unthinkable. That night, Alex led Emeka to a secluded bush under the pretense of teaching him more about the Word of God. The boy's excitement was palpable as he carried his Bible, eager to learn. Alex's hands trembled as he spoke to Emeka, reciting verses he could barely focus on. The boy noticed his unease. "Pastor, are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Alex swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, Emeka. Let's continue." But when the moment came, Alex faltered. The boy's trusting eyes and innocent questions pierced his soul. He wanted to stop, to run, but the weight of Tony and Colin's threats crushed him. With tears streaming down his face, Alex committed the unspeakable. Emeka's screams echoed in his ears long after the deed was done. When he handed over the boy's kidney to Tony and Collins that night, they praised him like a loyal soldier. "Good job, Pastor," Tony said with a smirk. "You're one of us again." But Alex felt no relief, only an unbearable weight of guilt. He returned home that night a shattered man, his soul irreparably stained. He couldn't sleep for weeks, haunted by the boy's laughter and the grief of his parent when they discover his body. He prayed for forgiveness, but his prayers felt hollow. The God he had preached about now seemed distant, unreachable. And deep down, Alex knew this wasn't the end. Tony and Collins would be back for more. He avoided Emeka's grieving parents at all costs, offering vague excuses whenever they sought him out for solace. Instead, he locked himself in his study, praying fervently for forgiveness, though his words felt hollow and insincere. But the nightmare wasn't over. A few weeks later, Tony and Collins returned, their demands sharper and more ruthless than before. This time they didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need another organ," Tony said coldly, tossing a briefcase of cash on Alex's desk as if to seal the deal. "You've already crossed the line. There's no turning back now." Alex's voice trembled as he replied, "I told you, never again. What I did was wrong. I can't go through with it anymore." Collins leaned forward, his grin venomous. "You think you have a choice, Pastor? Let me remind you of what's at stake. Your precious church, your perfect family, your reputation. All of it will crumble if we expose you. And don't think we won't," Tony added, his tone dripping with menace. He pulled out his phone and played a chilling audio recording. Emeka's screams, raw and agonized, filled the room. Alex's stomach churned as Tony continued, "Imagine what happens if we let this leak. Your congregation would lynch you before the police even get involved." Alex slumped into his chair, defeated. The threats were relentless and the risk of exposure was too great. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to fight back, but fear had wrapped itself around his heart like a vice. "What do you want me to do?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Collins smirked triumphantly. "The same thing you did last time. Find someone. Make it clean. And don't screw this up." The demands only escalated. Under their coercion, Alex began targeting members of his own congregation. Those who trusted him implicitly, those who saw him as a spiritual father. Each victim was lured away under the guise of private Bible lessons, prayer retreats, or counseling sessions. To cover his tracks, Alex dug a massive grave miles away from the church, hidden behind a large rock formation and surrounded by thick underbrush. Under the cover of darkness, he dragged the lifeless bodies there, dumping them into the earth after harvesting their organs. The grave became a grotesque symbol of his moral decay, a testament to the depths he had fallen. The disappearances did not go unnoticed. Families began mourning their missing loved ones, whispering among themselves about the strange happenings within the church. Suspicion brewed like a storm cloud, and the once vibrant congregation grew uneasy. Meanwhile, Alex's demeanor changed drastically. The once charismatic pastor became withdrawn, paranoid, and visibly tormented. His sermons lost their spark, his voice often breaking as he preached about sin and redemption. He avoided eye contact with his congregation, feeling the weight of their stares like daggers piercing his soul. Among the grieving families were Emeka's parents, who became increasingly vocal in their search for their son. They knew Emeka often spent time at the church, especially when he wasn't in school. They approached Alex directly one Sunday after service, their eyes filled with desperation. "Pastor," Emeka's father began, his voice trembling. "Please, have you seen our son? You know how much he loved coming here. You were his hero. He wouldn't just disappear like this." Alex forced a sympathetic expression, though his heart pounded violently in his chest. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice soft and measured. "I wish I could help, but I haven't seen Emeka in weeks. I've been praying for him every day, asking God to bring him home safely." Emeka's mother clutched her husband's arm, tears streaming down her face. "But he trusted you, Pastor," she whispered. "He said you were helping him grow in faith. How could he just vanish?" Alex sighed heavily, shaking his head as if burdened by the weight of their sorrow. "The devil is at work," he said, his tone solemn. "But we must remain steadfast in faith. God will reveal the truth in his time." The parents left reluctantly, but doubts lingered in their hearts. They began asking questions among the congregation, piecing together the strange pattern of missing individuals, many of whom had also been close to Pastor Alex. Meanwhile, the police launched an investigation into the string of disappearances. Officers interviewed church members, neighbors, and local vendors, their questions increasingly pointed. Alex maintained his facade of innocence, even volunteering to lead prayer sessions for the missing. "We must pray for justice," he declared during one such session, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and guilt. "And we must trust that God is in control." But his charade was wearing thin. The stress of his double life began to take a visible toll. He lost weight, his face grew gaunt, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. The congregation whispered among themselves, wondering what had happened to their once vibrant pastor. The police intensified their efforts, tracking patterns and tracing the last known movements of the missing individuals. After 3 months of relentless investigation, the trail eventually led to Pastor Alex's church. Detectives began questioning Alex directly, their tone sharp and probing. "Pastor," one officer asked during an interrogation, "how well did you know Emeka? His parents say he spent a lot of time with you." Alex's hands clenched tightly under the table. "Emeka was a bright boy," he said carefully, avoiding eye contact. "I taught him Bible lessons, but I haven't seen him in a long time. I've been praying for his safe return." The officer studied him closely, her gaze piercing. "And the others? There seems to be a pattern here, Pastor. Young, vulnerable individuals disappearing after being closely involved with your church." Alex's composure faltered, but he quickly masked it with feigned outrage. "Are you accusing me of something, officer? I've dedicated my life to serving God in this community. I would never harm anyone." But behind closed doors, Alex's facade crumbled. He knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. As he stared at his reflection in the mirror, his hollow eyes stared back and he whispered, "God, forgive me. I've become a monster." One fateful day, a group of prayer warriors from the church decided to embark on a spiritual retreat to a secluded mountain miles away. The air was fresh, the birds sang hymns of their own, and the group prayed fervently, seeking divine intervention for the recent disappearance. Midway through their prayers, a foul stench filled the air, so pungent that it disrupted their focus. The group exchanged concerned glances, whispering to one another. "What could it be?" someone asked, covering their nose. Curiosity overtook them, and they decided to investigate the source of the smell. They moved cautiously, searching the dense underbrush, guided by the nauseating odor. Hours passed, and just as they were about to give up, one of them stumbled upon a partially concealed grave. A scream pierced the air as they uncovered the shallow grave. 5 decomposed bodies lay within. The sight was horrifying, faces frozen in terror, and bodies showing signs of mutilation. Among them was Emeka, partially decomposed but still recognizable by the distinct pendant he always wore. The group immediately contacted the authorities, their prayers replaced by cries of anguish and disbelief. As the police cordoned off the area, news of the discovery spread like wildfire, sending shockwaves through the community. Back at the church, Pastor Alex was preparing for his Sunday sermon. Dressed impeccably in his suit, he rehearsed his message on hope and faith, unaware that his world was about to collapse. Just as Alex took the pulpit and began his sermon, the church doors burst open. Armed police officers stormed in, their presence silencing the congregation. Gasps and murmurs filled the air as they approached the altar. "Pastor Alex, you are under arrest," one officer announced, his voice firm and unyielding. Alex froze, his Bible slipping from his trembling hands. "There must be a mistake," he stammered, his voice barely audible. The congregation watched in stunned silence as the officers handcuffed their beloved pastor. Some wept, others whispered in disbelief. "What could he have done?" an elderly woman asked, clutching her chest. Alex was led out of the church, his head hung low. The weight of his sins bore down on him as he faced the horrified stares of his flock. Months after Alex's arrest, the police expanded their investigation. The evidence from the grave pointed to more than one perpetrator, and the hunt for Tony and Collins intensified. Just as they were about to flee the country, Tony and Collins were intercepted at the airport. Their attempted escape only solidified their guilt. Arrested and brought back in chains, they joined Alex in facing justice. The courtroom was packed during the trial. Members of the congregation, families of the victims, and curious onlookers filled every seat, their faces a mix of anger and sorrow. As the prosecution presented its case, the once revered Pastor Alex was unmasked as a man with a dark and horrifying secret. Photographs, testimonies, and forensic evidence painted a grim picture of betrayal and bloodshed. This man, who stood as a symbol of hope, used his position to commit unspeakable atrocities, the prosecutor declared, pointing at Alex. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, disbelief hanging thick in the air. When Emeka's parents took the stand, their tearful testimonies brought many to tears. "He was just a boy," his mother sobbed. "We trusted him. We trusted him." The defense had little to counter the overwhelming evidence. Alex, Tony, and Collins were found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life imprisonment. In prison, Alex's once commanding presence was reduced to a shadow of its former self. Sleep became a distant memory, replaced by endless nights of regret and self-loathing. One day, a group of preachers visited the prison to minister to the inmates. Their message was one of hope, redemption, and God's boundless mercy. Alex sat at the back of the room, his head bowed. The words pierced his heart, stirring a flicker of hope amidst the darkness. When the preachers spoke of God's ability to forgive even the worst of sinners, Alex broke down. Tears streamed down his face as he approached them. "Can God ever forgive someone like me?" he asked, his voice trembling with guilt. The preachers looked at him with compassion. "No sin is too great for God's mercy," one of them said. "If you truly repent, He will forgive you." They prayed with Alex, their hands resting on his shoulders. For the first time in months, Alex felt a glimmer of peace. In the years that followed, Alex dedicated himself to ministering to his fellow inmates. Though he would never forget his sins, he used his time to warn others of the dangers of greed, deceit, and burying one's past instead of facing it. Emeka's parents, though heartbroken, eventually forgave Alex after years of soul-searching and prayer. Their act of forgiveness became a symbol of true grace in the community. Pastor Alex's story serves as a cautionary tale. Our choices, no matter how deeply buried, have consequences that can ripple through time. As the preacher said that day in the prison, "Be mindful of your choices, for they can shape your future in ways you can never imagine." If you enjoy this story, please click the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.